The Calvino Shuffle, the Arithmetic of Miracles. Prologue. I sell cold air for a living. On the side of my van, in big block letters, it says Arrowhead Air, Service, Installation, Miracles Not Included. I painted that slogan as a joke, back when the only miracles I could afford were on the radio between traffic and weather. But in the dark stripe of morning when the first calls ping my phone, there is a moment, just a breath. The world hushes, and it feels like someone's dealing me a fresh deck. You're about to hear a story that sounds improbable. I will not ask you to believe in the supernatural. I will ask you to count. Because all my miracles were born in arithmetic, and arithmetic has a way of making even the strangest coincidences stand up and salute. It started with two ideas. The first arrived through a screen, a late-night video with a title that sounded like a dare. The speaker invoked a writer named Calvino and talked about how experience can be sliced, shuffled, and reordered, how a life can be read the way you read a deck of cards, stories dealt into new patterns, meanings rising when the same cards land side by side in a different light. I watched it twice, then a third time, and somewhere between midnight and the blue hour I wrote in my work notebook, Calvino Shuffle, reorder the world, don't change it. The second idea I found in a book of mathematical gossip and in a modern summary online. It said roughly, if you live like people live, you will see something with odds of 1 in a million about once a month. Littlewood's law. 1 miracle per month on average, if you keep your eyes open and your sample size large. I am a service clerk. I answer phones. I schedule trucks. I carry ladder rash up my shins and static in my hair, and I pay more in gas than in poetry. But I'm also the fellow who watched those two ideas clink together like ice in a glass and thought, what if the world isn't sparse on miracles? What if it's crowded with them, and all I need is a way to stack the deck so my miracles fall where customers can see them? And so I began to shuffle. Episode 1, Thermostat 0. The first miracle I ever orchestrated happened at 3:33 p.m. on a Wednesday, which is a time that begs to be noticed. Mrs. Lasker, who keeps a porcelain greyhound by the door and calls the office every spring like a bird remembering an old route, had a complaint. Her smart thermostat was haunted. It kept drifting to 74 degrees Fahrenheit all by itself. 74, she said. I set it to 72 and it slides up to 74 like it's got opinions. I could have told her the truth right away, that her thermostat, in all its silicon wisdom, runs a comfort optimizer that nudges settings based on inferred occupancy. That 3 o'clock is when her grandson comes home and the system guesses it can be lazy. But I'd been thinking about the Calvino Shuffle, about how stories are made of order more than facts. So instead I said, Mrs. Lasker, let me try an experiment. At exactly 3:33 today, walk to the hallway and look at your thermostat. 3:33, she said, suspicious as a cat. Why that time? Because 3's a lucky number, I lied, and booked a diagnostic for the next morning. I didn't touch her thermostat. I touched 12 others. In the programming interface most folks never open, there's a field called Peer Network that lets thermostats chat about occupancy and utility rates. Months ago, I had mapped the network for a subdivision that includes Mrs. Lasker's street. If I told the cluster there would be a demand spike at 3:33, they'd compromise. The whole flock would creep 2 degrees toward thrift, then coast back. It's a nudge the power company loves and homeowners barely notice unless someone tells them where to look. At 3:33 p.m., Mrs. Lasker looked. The number 74 gloated at her in lollipop digits. She gasped, called me, and left a voicemail so breathless it sounded like she'd found a message from the beyond. The next morning I arrived with a fresh battery pack and a smile. I opened her thermostat, reseated a connector that did not need reseating, and performed the exorcism. I typed Peer Network, opt out. We stood together and watched the display. It stayed stubbornly at 72. She clapped. She asked how I knew the ghost would show itself at 3:33. Pattern, I said. If you watch long enough, the world reveals a rhythm. That was the day I learned a crucial distinction. I was not creating miracles. I was arranging for them to be witnessed. Littlewood's clock was always running. All I did was set the alarm and invite someone to be in the room when it rang. Episode 2. Coins in the Compressor. Back then, Arrowhead Air was me, a bookkeeper named Ronnie who preferred numbers that sat still, and two techs, Manny and Jules, who could deadlift a condenser but treated paperwork like a hostile animal. The phone rang enough to keep us busy. The bank account coughed enough to keep me honest. Success was a suit I tried on at home in front of the mirror and put back on the hanger when I heard a truck backing up outside. The call came from an apartment complex where the property manager, Tessa, sounded newly divorced from luck. "Half my building is hot," she said. "We had another company out twice. They say the compressors are fine. The tenants say they aren't. Another company out twice is music to my ears. It means the narrative has already set up a villain and a foil. All I had to do was bring a third act. We rolled 2 vans and a cart of spare parts that cost more than my first car. Manny popped the panel on Unit 2B, and there it was, the compressor singing a grating metallic lullaby, amps bobbing like driftwood. The refrigerant charge was right, pressures decent, capacitor new. "Gremlins," Manny said. "Gremlins don't obey OSHA," I said, and held my palm near the compressor dome. It rattled like a jar full of pennies. "Kill the breaker," I said. I drained the oil, tipped the unit, and shook. Clink, clink, clink. 3 corroded coins tumbled out of the suction line clean out, which some genius had left uncapped. "How?" Tessa started. I shrugged as if I had merely guessed. I had not guessed. Last week, during a filter change walkthrough, I had seen kids tossing coins into the open clean-out like it was a wishing well. I'd told maintenance to cap it. They hadn't. So I waited. Littlewood says 1 in a million miracles happen monthly. In a complex with 300 apartments, 100 kids, and an unapologetic curiosity about holes, this was not a miracle. It was an invoice waiting to be written. We fixed it in 30 minutes. Tessa watched me fish the last coin from the P-trap with a magnet and said, "You're a miracle worker." "Just a mechanic," I said, and handed her the capped clean-out. "If you don't want miracles, cap your variables." She laughed. She gave us a standing order. Somewhere between Units 2B and 4F, Arrowhead Air acquired a reputation, the company that found the unbelievable reason and made the unbelievable stop happening. Episode 3. The Pastor's Lottery. There are 2 ways to earn trust, be early and be inevitable. I tried to be both. Pastor Ray called about the church's fellowship hall, a sprawl of a room with ceiling fans that made a show of stirring the air, and an HVAC system that had given up around the time the choir did. When I arrived, he was counting raffle tickets at a folding table while 3 parishioners argued about whether miracles should be expected or accepted. "I don't peddle miracles," I said, because the joke on my van had already made it around town. "I peddle comfort, which is close in July." He smiled, the practiced smile of a man who officiates daily hope. "Comfort will do." I gave him a price for a new 10-ton package unit that made him close his eyes like he was memorizing a prayer. Then I told him I'd come back Sunday morning with fans and a temporary chiller as a courtesy, and he looked like someone had paid him a compliment with both hands. That Sunday, I arrived with the chiller, 4 industrial fans, and a plan. I had spent an afternoon with church bulletins and old sermons, learning names, rhythms, and the single paragraph in the church bylaws that put all facility repairs under the purview of the event committee, which meant Pastor Ray needed a miracle or a meeting, and the committee always chose the meeting. I placed the chiller where the congregation would have to walk past it. I set a small table next to it with a jar and a sign that read, "Cooling our fellowship. Every coin counts." I had primed the jar, not by seeding it with 20s, that trick backfires, but by making sure the first person past the table was Sister Helen, a woman of implacable habit. I had met her on the phone 3 days earlier and knew she carried bills folded into squares, always the same pocket, always the same way. When she slowed at the jar, I said, "Sister Helen, we're about to turn this on. Will you do the honors?" I held out the plug. She slipped a bill into the jar and plugged the chiller in. The fans thrummed. The room sighed. By the end of the service, the jar held an amount I could not ethically accept, so I didn't. I told Pastor Ray to deposit it and call a meeting of the committee. He did. In the meeting, I recited the temperature curves from my data logger and the savings model for a higher SEER unit as if I were singing the Psalms. When the vote came, they approved the purchase unanimously. Pastor Ray called it Providence. I called it the Calvino Shuffle, a reordering of events so that the card with my phone number landed next to the card labeled Inevitability. Episode 4. The Lottery of Parts. Supply chains are prayer rugs laid out in warehouses, and I learned to kneel with a stopwatch. The big distributors had back orders on the coil I needed for a grocery store that had declared a state of emergency over melting popsicles. I could have told them to throw a blanket over the freezer and hope. Instead, I drove to a salvage yard outside the county line, where units go to die and to be revived in second acts. In the corner of a covered lot, behind a stack of old rooftop units, I found a coil with the right dimensions and a serial number that made my hands tingle. Only 2 years old, Yankee brand, the very model nobody had in stock. I checked the fins, pressure tested it, and called Ronnie to wire the money. On the way back, I thought about Littlewood. 1 in a million is a way of speaking, not the way of the world. In our county alone, there are hundreds of grocery stores, thousands of coils, and an army of desperate handwritten parts lists. If you walk the salvage yards often enough, if you keep the deck shuffled and your eyes open, the miraculous match will eventually turn up. What I did differently was simple. I counted chances the way gamblers count outs. I made a list of every yard, every backroom, every technician who owed me a favor. I called them all. I asked the same question. I put myself in the path of the answer. We installed the coil that evening. The manager hugged me in front of the novelty freezer, which gave off a smell like candy dreams thawing. By morning, he had posted a picture of my van on the store's social media with a caption that used the word savior. I typed and deleted 5 replies. Then I wrote, "We just got lucky." It was the truth dressed in humility, the sort of sentence that makes luck return your calls. Episode 5. The Data Center. The contract that changed Arrowhead Air came dressed as a catastrophe. At 2:11 a.m. on a Thursday, my phone screamed with the tone I reserve for the last call before litigation. A data center on the bypass had lost cooling to 2 of its server rooms. Their top vendor wasn't picking up. We were 4th on the list, which meant we were about to become first or forgotten. Servers don't like heat. They give up their secrets when they get hot. Then they give up the ghost. I drove as fast as the law and a fragile van allowed, hand on the dash like I was steadying an old friend. The rooms were already sweating, air dense as a sauna. I felt the prickle of 1,000 tiny lives depending on me. The infants of the modern world are emails and credit histories and photos of graduations, and all of them were wheezing in the heat. "Chillers failed," the night manager said. "Backup failed. We called Hurlburt Mechanical. They said they were rolling. That was an hour ago." I don't like to speak ill of a rival. Fortune, however, loves a farce. Hurlburt's dispatcher had sent 1 truck to the wrong address and another to a similarly named site 2 towns over. The 3rd tech was stuck behind a train that declared itself infinite. In a city with 1 river and more trains than good sense, this was not unusual. It was monthly. We set our portable units in the door thresholds to push cold into the rooms while Manny and Jewel bled air from the chiller lines, and I traced a control signal that looked like someone had tied it in a knot. I reset a relay with a ballpoint pen and the chiller coughed to life. The room temperature bent down like a debt repaid. At dawn, the facility's operations director arrived in a crisp shirt that had never met a wrinkle and shook my hand like I was his childhood scout leader. He took a tour of our temporary setup and said, "How did you get here so fast?" "Traffic parted," I said, and let him think what he liked. The truth is, I had been charting late-night road closures on a yellow pad for months because a certain railroad had a habit of parking its grievances across town, and I had learned to route myself through neighborhoods where motion endured. This was the Calvino shuffle applied to asphalt. Reorder the sequence of streets so the outcome reads arrival instead of excuse. 2 weeks later, the data center signed a maintenance contract worth more than my house. That was when Arrowhead Air stopped being a rumor and became an address. Episode 6, County Fair. Success is loud. It bangs around a shop the way a newly adopted dog bangs around a kitchen, knocking into trash cans, scattering lists, insisting you notice. We hired 2 more techs, leased a second van, and Ronnie upgraded from her flip phone to a gleaming rectangle that looked like an aquarium for ghosts. Customers brought us pies. Competitors brought us gossip. The bank brought us forms. In August, the county fair asked small businesses to set up booths. We don't sell scented candles or grill equipment. We sell invisible comfort and scolded thermostats. But I said yes and printed flyers that promised cold air and small wonders, which is an honest slogan if you believe what I believe. I set up a table with a clear plastic duct, a smoke generator, and a deck of cards. The duct and smoke drew kids like gravity. The cards drew their parents. I don't call what I do magic, because I don't palm cards well and I don't want a child to think the world needs permission from the supernatural to astonish. What I do is an old street trick with new clothing. I get people to shuffle their day until the card they were always going to see looks like it chose them. Pick a card, I told a woman in a denim jacket. She picked the 7 of hearts. I asked her to slide it back into the deck anywhere she liked. Then I performed what I privately call the Calvino shuffle. I overhanded the cards in a way that kept track of where her 7 lived. I let fate cut the deck once, and I told the story of the day, how she had decided to stop by the fair because of a text from a friend, how the text had arrived because a parking spot opened, how the spot opened because a driver saw a stroller and waved them through, how the stroller paused because the baby stared at the smoke ring rising from my duct. I turned the top card. It was the 7 of hearts. She laughed, the laugh people laugh when order asserts itself over chaos. Do another, she said. I did it 10 times that afternoon, sometimes missing and letting the miss teach what the hit could not. Miracles are not guarantees. They are densities. If you create enough density, of attention, of chances, of small engineering choices that slope toward a reveal, you will more often than you have any right to watch the world appear to bloom on cue. Episode 7, Weather Report. On a Wednesday driest as a chalkboard, the weatherman promised a high of 96 degrees Fahrenheit with a heat index of find an excuse to stay home. I promised a restaurant owner named Lila that her elderly rooftop units would soldier through one more weekend without embarrassing her brunch. This promise was unreasonable on its face. I made it because the band was good and I'd already bought tickets and I didn't want to spend Saturday elbow deep in a condenser coil that looked like a hay bale. Here's what I knew. The units were marginal, the weather models were quarreling, and the city's microclimates made fools out of averages. Here's what I did. I installed a simple misting bar that used reclaimed condensate to pre-cool the intake air by a few degrees. I calibrated her thermostats to let the dining room ride half a degree warmer if humidity dropped by 2. I cleaned the coils like a baptized soul. I stretched a shade sail over the roof, and I prayed in the secular way that means you invest your hope in hours of preparation. At noon, the heat index soared. At 4, the wind shifted. At 6, a cloud bank ambled in like a tired uncle and sat on the sun. By 7, Lila texted me a picture of the brunch schedule with the words, "You wizard." I am not a wizard. I am a man who reads the local weather forum where retired engineers argue about dew points. I'm a man who noticed that the cloud bank that always ruins sunsets for couples at the bluff often arrives just when the river breeze turns. I am a man who learned that if you bet on the bend instead of the straightaway, you look like a prophet from certain angles. Episode 8, The Missing Dog. Miracles are only miracles because a witness has skin in the game. An event without a stake is a shrug. Mrs. Klein sobbed at my counter while her AC wheezed and her dog Bruno ran an errand for chaos. "He's gone," she said, "and it's too hot for posters." The paper curls. On my desk, I kept a notebook where I recorded little frictions of the city, which alleys gathered wind at dusk, which intersections made delivery drivers curse, which yards had the kind of fence a determined dog could persuade. I had, on the previous Thursday, written Bruno jumps. I pretended to think for a long time, then said, "Go to the ball field at Belmont at 5:15. Stand by the third base dugout. Shake the treat bag." "How do you know?" "I don't," I said. "But if I were Bruno, I'd chase the sound of concessions. It's Little League night. They keep the gate ajar for kids who forget their gloves. Dogs who jump fences jump gates." At 5:39, she sent a photo of Bruno staring into the treat bag like it was a parable. "You knew," she wrote. "I didn't. I guessed within the generous, lazy bounds of probability, pasting the shape of a dog onto the geometry of a summer evening. But to her, and to Bruno, and to anyone who saw two pictures, the empty yard and the retrieved dog, it looked like the universe had bent in her favor. Perhaps it had, perhaps not. The important part to me was that I had taken her out of helplessness and into action. The Calvino shuffle isn't just reordering events, it's reordering agency. Episode 9, The CEO and the Server Room. A CEO named Vance arrived in my office with the haircut of someone who employs a barber with a non-disclosure agreement. His company leased the other half of the data center's campus, and he wanted to switch to Arrowhead because, as he put it, Hurlburt saved us last year, but they looked like they were praying. I told him prayer is overrated for engineering and underrated for taxes. Then I gave him a tour of our shop that looked casual and was not, the safety training plaques near the door, the framed letter from the State Utilities Coalition on the wall, Manny and Jules rolling in at an hour that suggested stamina, not desperation. I'm not a natural showman, but I know how to build a frame. We walked to the vans. A train snarled across the noon sky, horn blasting. Vance took a call, then pointed at the van's slogan. "Miracles not included?" he said. "Why?" "Expectation management," I said. "Also the truth." He chuckled. He signed. He asked for my cell number, and I gave it to him because that is a ritual the powerful repeat until it becomes a charm. 2 months later, at 2:03 a.m., my phone rang. The server room, heat climbing, a control system looped into a positive feedback tantrum. Vance was on site, pale with the adrenaline of someone whose hourly revenue could fund a small opera house. I arrived with a borrowed laptop and a knotted stomach. The loop was a known bug in a firmware patch rolled out to a subset of controllers whose serial numbers ended in 7. I had read the advisory at lunch. I had not expected to need it at 2:03 a.m., but Littlewood's calendar tore a page and handed me the pen. I typed the command to roll back the patch, and the room temperature curve flexed downward. Vance steadied himself against a rack and said, "How did you—" I tapped the screen where the serial number ended in a jaunty 7. "I read the minutes of the last users group so you don't have to." He nodded, then told me something that made my ribs feel like they weren't sure whether to expand or contract. "We just closed on a facility in Phoenix," he said. "You fly?" Episode 10, My Month of Miracles. After Phoenix, the world arrived with a megaphone. We took on a partner for capital, bought a small building that had been a bowling alley in a past life, and printed the new slogan Ronnie wrote on every invoice. "Expect coincidence." It made some customers laugh and made others settle in their chairs with a glint in their eyes, like they had joined a club that knew the secret handshake. Every month I chose a miracle. Not in the sense that I picked one to happen, but in the sense that I chose where to stand when it did. Sometimes I stood by the phone when a call arrived from a number I had written on an index card labeled Someday. Sometimes I stood on a roof when the clouds did their expected, unexpected trick. Sometimes I stood in a meeting where a person across a table confessed a need I carried a solution for in the documents folder on my tablet, pre-named and pre-numbered and pre-signed. I kept a log. Month 1, coin and compressor, solved in a scene. Month 2, coil from salvage, salvaged the contract. Month 3, data center midnight save, brought a sunrise. Month 4, cloud bank reprieve. Month 5, firmware bug rollback, saw the number 7 like a flare. Month 6, the county fair, 7 of hearts. Month 7, Bruno. Month 8, A miracle that did not happen to me, but near me, like some meteors that write their poems just offshore and let the lighthouse do the bragging. I began to dress the part without meaning to, not like a magician, no cape, no flourish, but like someone for whom inevitability had become a uniform. Clean work pants, shirt pressed, clipboard I actually used. In photographs, I looked like a responsible man. This is, I learned, one of the great tricks. Be responsible, and people will trust your miracles more than they fear them. Interlude, history, history. I did not invent the idea that coincidence can be understood statistically. I did not invent the idea that life can be rearranged and thus yield new meanings. I found both, the way a mechanic finds a forgotten tool in the back of a drawer and thinks it new because it is new to him. I watched a talk about shuffling experience and learned a writer's word for what my hands already like to do. I read about a mathematician who declared that with enough events in a month, one extraordinary thing becomes ordinary. Then I woke up, put my boots on, and went looking for the ordinary extraordinary. See also, confirmation bias, which I try to defang by writing down my failures. The gambler's fallacy, tattooed on my pride. The law of truly large numbers, both a comforter and a cynic. And showmanship, which I learned from my grandfather who could make a cranky lawnmower feel like a story with a plot. References, a shelf of technical manuals with coffee stains, a yellow pad full of street maps with circles drawn where trains die and clouds turn, a notebook labeled Auditors with entries like Mrs. Hahn sees owls everywhere, owls on fabric, cars, menus. If you want her to notice something, put an owl near it. External links, a city that refuses to be predicted until you ask it the right question. Episode 11, The Investor. I never wanted an investor. Investors are like air conditioners. By the time you admit you need one, you've already sweated through the part where dignity was an option. But expansion eats cash the way summer eats ice. And a man named Porter arrived with a suit that looked like consequence turned into cloth. He asked me to tell him how I made luck. I told him I didn't. He asked me to show him my books. I did. He asked me whether miracles scale. Scale? No, I said. Density? Yes. He frowned in the way money frowns when you confuse it. I told him about Littelwood and his 1 in a million per month and about how that is not prophecy but proportion. If you double your sample, customers, calls, chances, you double the frequency of moments that feel like lightning issuing you a receipt. I told him I had learned to build cascades, a meeting that leads to a favor that leads to a shared spreadsheet that leads to a phone number that 6 weeks later rings at the exact moment a train parks. He invested. He did not call it faith. He called it participation in an emergent advantage. I called it a miracle that wore cufflinks. Episode 12, The Talk Show. The city has a morning show watched by those who own their mornings and by those whose mornings own them. I was invited to sit on a couch upholstered in a shade of optimism and tell the story of how a man with a van and a calculator found himself in the business of making people say, "No way." The host, whose hair obeyed a contract, asked for a demonstration. I asked the crew to switch off the studio lights for a moment. In the dimness, I held up my phone to illuminate my hands and asked the host to name any temperature. She said, 68. I told her to watch the studio thermostat when the lights came back on. The lights surged. The studio thermostat dipped 2 degrees like it had been nudged by an invisible elbow. The host gasped. The audience applauded. The stage manager gave me a look like I had rewired the laws of physics. The trick was as old as theater. Lights are heat. Studio lights are little suns. When you switch them off for 45 seconds, the nearby sensor cools at exactly the rate you expect. When you switch them back on, there is a lag before the heat finds the sensor again. I had timed the lag during rehearsal and written the cue line on the inside of my wrist. Ask for 68. After the show, my inbox bloomed. So did my misgivings. Showmanship is a cousin to manipulation that sometimes forgets to go home for the holidays. I told myself I was teaching people to see the arithmetic behind the ore, but ore does not always consent to be explained. It prefers a halo. Episode 13, The House of Cards. Every trick has a cost. If you don't pay it up front, the universe claps later and gives you a bill with interest. Mine arrived on a Tuesday with a knock and a badge. Two auditors from a government agency with a name that sounded like a post office married to a calculator walked into my office and asked for records. Anonymous complaints alleged that Arrowhead Air engaged in deceptive practices, an accusation interesting for the fact that it is both technically true and morally complicated. I sat with them in the conference room and explained the misting bars, the firmware rollbacks, the salvage yard coils with serial numbers like Lucky Charms. I explained the theatre of the fair and the physics of the studio thermostat, and the map of train delays that lived in my head like a video game level. I explained that I did not fake outcomes. I faked timing. I asked permission for witnesses. They took notes the way accountants conjugate nouns. Then one of them, a woman with kind eyes that had clearly interrogated kinder men, asked the only dangerous question, "Do you ever arrange the world so that a problem exists you are then hired to solve?" I thought about the uncapped clean-out at the apartments. I thought about the time I swapped a sluggish relay for a new one with a small switch on the side that would, after a week, click into a fault state if you didn't set it properly. Something most techs miss. Something I never miss. I thought about the jar at Pastor Ray's church and whether the word arrange had a moral weight I preferred not to weigh. I arrange for problems to be seen, I said. I do not cause them. This was true at the time I said it. It became complicated the next month. Episode 14, Blackout Cascade. October arrived with the metallic promise of winter. The data center had scheduled a firmware update to a cooled aisle control system, the kind that calculates comfort like a stock trader calculates lunch. I had warned them to wait a week. They had nodded in the way people nod when they mean to agree later. They updated. The update included a logic change that was fine in the lab and ornery in the wild. A feedback loop oscillated, tripped a breaker, and a portion of the room went dark. We rolled trucks, we brought the portable units, we brought our reputations, and for the first time since I started keeping a log, the density of luck dropped. A train, of course, parked across our best route. A secondary control module failed in a way that was statistically breathtaking. A set of doors that were normally unlocked on weekends were locked because the weekend security guard was home with a fever. Each event alone is a shrug. Together they were a collage that looked uncomfortably like hubris. We stabilized the room, but not before a cascade of reboots reached a cluster that stored someone's financial reconciliation in a state that would later be described in a lawsuit as unrecoverable. The center's insurer counted the hours, then counted the damages, then counted our name among the defendants because we were famous enough to be worth suing. Porter, our investor, called it a storm. Vance called it an outrage. Ronnie called it Tuesday. I called my lawyer. That night I went home and stared at the ceiling fan spinning in the gentle eddy my small bedroom had always made, a pattern I could have described with my eyes closed. I thought about Littlewood and his 1 in a million. We count the hits. We forget the misses because they're boring, or we call them inevitable and make a face. But the law of truly large numbers has no opinion about our preferences. It delivers miracles and disasters at the rate of math, not mercy. Episode 15, The Twist. I wish I could tell you the lawsuit made me noble. It made me careful. There is a difference. In the deposition, they asked me whether I had ever gamed call schedules so that clients experiencing problems received faster service when a camera might be present. I said yes. They asked me whether I had ever adjusted a setting without noting it, confident that the problem would recur on a schedule I could predict and solve with fanfare. I said yes. They asked me whether I had ever seeded a solution, like placing a part where I could be certain to find it later. I said yes. You appear to see the world as a series of setups, the attorney said. I thought of Calvino and his deck of experience. I thought of the way a single day can be reordered into a meaning no single moment carries on its own. Yes, I said. They settled. Everyone settles sooner or later because trials are the casinos where outcomes dress like morality and bill by the hour. We paid money that stung but did not bleed. Our insurer lectured us about best practices until Manny fell asleep in the conference room and began to snore like a condenser motor with opinions. And now for the part you came for, the part that earns the narration by a man who sells cold air and arithmetic. The twist. After the settlement, the auditors asked to meet again. Not the badge and clipboard folks from compliance. Two different auditors from a different alphabet soup whose job is to watch the watchmen. Statistical auditors. They showed me a graph of our incidence of improbable solutions. "It is high," the first said, tapping the line that arced like a smile. "That was the business model," I said. "That is the problem," the second replied. "Your outcomes deviate so far from the county mean that they fall into what we uncharitably call an outlier basin. We have a mandate to investigate outliers. They asked to review all service tickets for the past 2 years. We opened the files. They ran their algorithms. They flagged patterns I had cultivated with care, the precise minutes I liked to deliver solutions because witnesses were likeliest, the serial number clusters I sought because of known bugs, the handful of salvaged parts that reappeared like minor characters in a novel, leaving fingerprints of narrative coherence on a dataset that prefers noise. You understand, the first auditor said, that even when everything is honest, your pattern looks dishonest. I do, I said. I've spent 2 years making honesty look like stagecraft. They gave me an option: participate in a research study about operational coincidence management in exchange for a recommendation that our license remain unsuspended. Remarkable. The way bureaucracy sometimes offers you a door in the wall, you were busy pounding with your head. I said yes. I let them shadow us for 3 months. I explained the Calvino shuffle in words no poet would approve and no mathematician would fully reject. I showed them the maps and the yellow pads and the way we placed ladders at angles that suggested readiness. I showed them that the miracles were not supernatural. They were choreography. At the end of the study, they wrote a paper with a title no one would finish reading and a conclusion no small business would find comforting: that with enough attention, one can amplify the perceived rate of miraculous outcomes by a factor of 3 to 5 without falsification. They called it a perception cascade. Then the twist twisted. A year later, a startup launched in a city with prettier skyscrapers than ours. They offered perception cascade management as a service. Their clients, contractors, consultants, anyone who sells confidence, could subscribe to a platform that ingested local weather, traffic, firmware advisories, supply inventories, and the social calendars of preachers, mayors, and school boards, then generated cue sheets for daily life. Stand here, say this, wait 11 seconds, now call, now check, now look. Their slogan: make the improbable punctual. They called me, of course. They asked me to be their chief field narratist. They offered stock options and a salary that could air condition a cathedral. They said I had invented the thing they were going to monetize. I said no, not because I disliked the money, because I knew the second twist and I wanted to be the one to narrate it. If everyone shuffles, no one shuffles. If everyone orchestrates the moment the thermostat drifts and the dog returns and the cloud arrives on cue, the density of awe returns to baseline. Littlewood's law remains, but it becomes invisible again because the world stops watching. Miracles per month fall back to 1, and the single miracle you notice is the day your subscription lapses and nothing happens and the silence tastes like humility. I stayed with Arrowhead. We kept our vans and our habits and our jar of odd parts that looked like plot devices. The auditors finished their study and went back to counting. The startup ballooned. Then, when investors realized that perception management is a commodity whose scarcity is its only sales pitch, deflated into a consulting firm that produced binders no one read and dashboards no one opened. But the universe remembers men who try to count it, and it remembers to make a point. On an evening so unremarkable I might have filed it under miscellaneous, I left the shop late. A train, infinite as regret, parked across 6th. I took the side street. At the light, a woman tapped my window. She was crying. She needed help. Her grandfather's oxygen concentrator had tripped a breaker. Her phone was dead. Her house was 5 blocks away. She had recognized the van. She asked if I could just... I could. I did. We fixed the breaker and replaced a cord that had melted into an apology. I carried the concentrator back to the bedroom and set it humming. The old man watched me with eyes like the underside of clouds. At the door, the granddaughter pressed a bill into my hand. I tried to refuse. She insisted. I took it. In the van under the dome light, I unfolded it into a square the way Sister Helen folds hers. It was $1. On the back, someone had stamped a tiny owl near the one blue ink, off-center. I laughed, a sound that startled me with its softness. I had not arranged that. I had not seeded an owl bill into the world and steered it back to my hand. I had merely driven when a train parked and stopped when a person knocked and did what I could with what I carry, which is to say, I shuffled nothing. I allowed the world to deal. The miracle per month does not always look like applause. Sometimes it looks like a man remembering that he was not hired to trick anyone into comfort, but to deliver it. This is the twist. The Calvino shuffle is not a machine for harvesting miracles. It is a practice for arranging attention so that when grace, mundane, unsupernatural, arithmetic grace passes by, you are in the doorway to see it. I mistook that doorway for a stage and built lights and scripts and cues. The universe smiled, patient, and waited for me to stand in a different doorway with no spotlight, where the card on top is the one that was always there, and the trick is admitting you didn't put it there. If you find yourself in need of cold air, call me. If you find yourself in need of a miracle, count to 1,000,000 and keep your eyes open. The odds are with you. And if, late at night, you hear a voice that sounds like mine say, "Submitted for your approval," a service clerk who learned to shuffle the world until the world shuffled him, please understand, I am not talking to the beyond. I am talking to you, from the vent in your ceiling, from the law in your ledger, from the deck you carry in your chest. Epilogue, notes and sources. You do not need my bibliography to live this story, but because television likes credits and I like to pay my debts, here are the ideas on which my miracle stood. Littlewood's law suggests that in the stream of ordinary life, events with odds of 1 in 1,000,000 occur roughly monthly, given enough events to count. I met that idea in a mathematician's miscellany, and I greet it weekly in the stubborn arithmetic of the job. The Calvino shuffle is what I call the art of reordering experience, combinatorial play turned into choreography. I found words for it in a talk that spoke of shuffling stories, and in a sentence by a writer who said each of us is an encyclopedia, a library, endlessly reorderable. I do not believe in magic. I believe in proximate causes, patient setups, and the dignity of a good reveal. Now the van door slides shut. The night is the color of a thermostat at rest. One more miracle this month, perhaps two, perhaps none. I'll be working either way. The end.